Welcome back to Let Them Eat Bread. It has been seemingly a long time since we've had an episode, but we are back, episode 40. And today, because it is the last evening of Passover, we are going to make matzah. By the way, for everyone celebrating Passover, belated Easter, and Ramadan, I hope you're enjoying your holidays or enjoyed your holidays. This convergence of Abrahamic religions apparently hasn't happened in a very long time. So cool to be living through some of that. Very excited. Hope everyone who celebrates one of those holidays or some other holiday that I didn't mention is having a great holiday season. So we are making matzah just on the tail end of Passover here, which will end tomorrow at sundown, or Saturday night at sundown. And because of the rules around kosher matzah, we can only take 18 minutes from the second the water hits the flour all the way to the end. So I have a timer, just like I did last year. Don't worry, you will not have to watch me for 18 minutes. I will cut this up and make this shorter, but I will be doing it with an actual timer, making sure that I have kosher for Passover matzah to make for you. And because everything needs to be done so quickly, we have all of our tools in front of us that we're going to need. So we're going to go through those real quickly. And then once we are totally ready to get going and everything is mise en place, we are going to start our matzah recipe. After we make our matzah, we're going to have two quick stories. One, of course, which is going to be the special segment, which does not go up to YouTube separately. And then one story that will go up separately to YouTube this week. All right, let's start prepping. So first of all, we have a cup of all-purpose flour. If you can get kosher Passover flour, feel free to use it. It is obviously makes it more kosher, but regular flour is fine. Also, we have half a cup of water here. Now, apparently you only need about a third of a cup to half a cup. So you might not use all of it, but good to have the upper limit just in case you do. You do not have time to get more ingredients if you need them. On the side here, we have a little bit of extra flour. We're going to be using this to flour our board and flour our rolling pin. You will need some type of rolling pin or flattening item since we will need to make this very flat. Fun fact, by the way, that I got from a friend of mine who is a cantor. Thank you, Leanna. The super flat, super crispy matzah is actually an invention of the Industrial Revolution. Before that, when matzah was made by hand, it was much less uniform. So we're going to try and get it to a uniform shape today. Just using kind of the basic kitchen tools. And to help us achieve that, we are going to use a pizza cutter. This will hopefully help us get our rectangular shapes as much as we want them. And of course, I have a fork for stirring, an additional fork for poking holes through the matzah. Behind me, my oven has a large tray in it. The tray is sitting, the tray I just took the temperature of is about 520 degrees. My oven is set to high broil, okay? I'm getting my oven as hot as I possibly can for the very short amount of time that matzah cooks for. We are looking for 2 minutes each side for our matzah to cook. So we're going to try and time this whole thing out so that by the time the matzah goes in the oven, we have 5 minutes left on our timer, okay? And so I'm going to bring up our timer right now. And I'm going to mute myself so you don't hear all the noise I'm making, but I'm going to set our timer and you will get to watch with me this timer. And I have to say, I'm very nervous. Last year, we cut it super close. Also, because your oven's very hot, make sure you have an oven mitt or some other kind of protective clothing so you're not reaching in an incredibly hot oven. Oh, all right, we can do this. We can do this. We can do this. All right, so I'm moving my over here. And so we're going to add our water a little bit at a time. But remember, the second the water hits the flour, you have 18 minutes, okay? So we really need to make sure that we get this done in the right amount of time. Oh, deep breath. All right, you ready? Let's do this. First, we are combining our water with our flour, little bits of water at a time, and just stirring vigorously. We're adding water until all the flour comes together into one ball. Next up, we are putting on our board and kneading for about 30 seconds. Now, I actually do this for longer than I should, but that is okay. Next up, we are going to push this down and make it as flat as we possibly can, flouring our work surface and our rolling pin. And with our hands, we're going to start the process, and then we're going to roll this out as much as we possibly can. And we're trying to make this at least 1/8 of an inch thick, but don't spend a ton of time on it because you really need that time in the oven, especially if you're cooking at a conventional oven that you have at home. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to cut these into 4 rectangles-ish. I'm using a pizza cutter to make it easier. And then we are going to stab this as many times, each of them as many times on both sides with a fork. This prevents rising and gives matzo that kind of holy texture that we're all used to. So just keep stabbing, you'll be great. Next up, we're going to get the last little bits of flour off of our pieces of matzah, and then we are going to take our tray, which has been preheating, out of the oven, and we are going to somewhat carefully, but not really carefully, put our matzah on it before throwing it back in the oven. All right. Next up, we are going to put it, so in the oven, it's going to cook for 2 minutes on each side, and you just keep repeating this process till you run at a time, and then ta-da! Boom, 7 seconds, cut it right on the margins. That was close, Ben. You did a great job this year. Let's see how it looks and tastes. It's looking pretty good right now. Let's see how it tastes. All right, so we cut it really close. I wanted to keep these in as long as possible, get as much of a crust on them as possible. I'm just going to show the camera. So this one here didn't get as crispy. This one was in for 2 minutes shorter than the others. I didn't think I could get it on the tray, but this one was in for the longest time. And look at the color on that. Isn't that beautiful? Can I even touch this? Yeah, I can touch it. Wow, look at that. Isn't that gorgeous? So this is it. This is much more like real matzah than we made last year. And the thing is, if you have extra time, you really should dedicate that time to the oven, right? Because we're working with kind of your typical home oven. And I had it on broil because that's the hottest I could get it, because it's a gas stove. It does the whole oven. But, when matzah is being made professionally, it's being made in kind of like pizza ovens. It's way, way hotter. We're looking like 900 degrees, okay? So if you have a pizza oven, actually, you can do that in there. But I think they turned out really well, actually. Let me, I'll see. Lauren will be proud of me for tasting something on the show. Yeah. That's definitely matzah. Wow. That's awesome. Oh, all right. So as promised, we are going to do some politics segment here. And so first, I'm going to clean up a little bit first because I was kind of panicking running around. So I will be right back. And when I come back, we will talk some politics. We've got 2 stories for you today, and we'll go right through those. All right. I'll be right back. All right. I'm back. Thanks so much for your patience. If you are quitting out at this point, you're more than welcome to, but there's really nothing to come back for. Or you can stick around with us, and we've got 2 stories for you today. And the first story I want to talk about is a little bit on the controversial side, so, saving it for the non-repeatable audience, unless you catch the whole episode, of course, which you are more than welcome to do. Today, I want to talk to you guys about the recent news that Russia was kicked off the UN Human Rights Council, which, by the way, I think overall is a piece of good news. Clearly, people who violate human rights, either through the use of chemical weapons or through the flagrant disregard of civilians or whatever it's going to be, all of those nations deserve to not be on the Human Rights Council. So it's a good move, but we should probably look at some of the other members that are on the UN Human Rights Council, including us, the United States, and Saudi Arabia. So while it's good news that Russia has been kicked off the UN Human Rights Council, it is important to remember that the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia are both still members of the UNHRC. And let's talk a little bit about the human rights abuses that Saudi Arabia and that the United States have gone through, that have perpetrated. And by the way, this is to say, this is not to diminish the human rights violations that the Russian Federation has committed in Ukraine. As I've mentioned in previous weeks of the show, and as I continue to say, it's really important that we call out these human rights abuses to make sure that the people who are committing them at least feel shame, if not some level of accountability. what is happening to the Ukrainians is terrible, and I'm glad the international community is responding in the way that it is. However, we should allow for similar levels of responses to what the Saudis are doing in Yemen. So the Yemen war, by the way, the U.S. has been by proxy participating in, given our funding of the Saudi regime with both with money for their oil, but also giving them huge weapons deals in exchange for favors that they do for us, and of course covering up their war crimes, not just in Yemen, of course, but in the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, who was butchered in an Istanbul embassy just 2 years ago now, I think it was 2 years ago. Anyway, so the Saudis are essentially perpetrating a genocide in Yemen. This is not just based on the fact that they are commencing brutal bombing and missile campaigns in places with large amounts of civilians, but also because the Saudi government is not letting food into the country and people are starving to death in huge numbers. And yet, for some reason, Saudi Arabia gets to stay on the UN Human Rights Council. Okay, so about the United States. So the United States has, of course, perpetrated lots of war crimes in the Middle East, but I'm not talking about the ones in the past. I'm talking about the ones we're doing right now. And that includes sanctioning Afghanistan, even though we essentially gave up in the war in Afghanistan and allowed the Taliban to take over. However, once we left, we decided we weren't a big fan of the Taliban any longer. So we are going to essentially use our hold on their economic resources, because the world reserve currency is the dollar, and many countries keep their reserves in dollars. We are going to use that power that we have to essentially tell the Afghan government that, sorry, you cannot have money to feed your people. And thus, millions of people in Afghanistan are currently starving to death because the United States refuses to give them any money for food. We also are not helping them with food directly, right? We could actually, if we were truly interested in protecting the people of Afghanistan, as our many news pundits would have you believe we were when we were pulling out of Afghanistan, we would actually provide food directly to them. If we're worried that the Taliban will misspend the money, we can always make sure that they don't misspend the money by keeping the money, but giving them the equivalent in food resources so that they can continue to feed their populations while not using the money for activities that the United States doesn't agree with. By the way, we lost that war, as I mentioned, and we should not actually have the amount of power that we have to keep their money out of their hands. It is their money. Whether we like it or not, we allowed the Taliban to gain control of the nation of Afghanistan, the now Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. And because of that, we need to allow them to access their money. Imagine someone didn't like, imagine the bank that you banked at, it's just a convenient bank for you. You told them that you were going to take your money out to, buy a motorcycle. The bank said, yeah, we actually don't like motorcycles. We think motorcycles are unsafe, and we think that you'll hurt yourself. So what we're going to do as your bank is we're going to freeze your assets. We're going to say you actually can't do that. Sorry. That would be ridiculous, because they're just doing you a service. The money isn't theirs. The money is yours. So the same thing is going on with the United States, causing the starvation of millions of people in Afghanistan. And of course, the United States is a proud member of the United Nations Human Rights Council. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge, as people who sit in criticism of governments, but also people who interact on the international stage, that although it's good that we are seeing the punishment of Russia for their crimes against humanity, we should look at other nations who are committing crimes against humanity and perhaps punish them as well. Lovely. Okay. So, second and last story for this week. I'm going to take you back to a story we talked about a long, long time ago called LinkedIn versus HiQ. For those of you who do not remember this story, allow me to refresh your memories a little bit. LinkedIn, as you know, is a large-scale social network used for businesses, used for kind of business and professional connections. Most of you watching probably have a LinkedIn. And HiQ, or HiQ Labs, is a small company who is essentially doing some scraping of LinkedIn in order to create databases and create data that they could then manipulate, use, sell, what have you. And so this was scraping, right? They were scraping all this data off of LinkedIn, and it actually turned out they were scraping a huge amount of data from LinkedIn. Now, LinkedIn wasn't very happy about this, of course, and so they filed a lawsuit against HiQ. Now, there was a little bit extra context around the timing of this lawsuit, so it wasn't necessarily that LinkedIn just found out about it. LinkedIn was actually going to start offering a service similar to the service that HiQ was offering, having to do with data-driven analytics. And it is assumed by HiQ, now, got to tell you whose side's saying what. It's assumed by HiQ that LinkedIn was suing them not because that they were inherently opposed to the data analytics stuff, but that they cared because it was going to cut into LinkedIn's particular market share for this product that LinkedIn was trying to create. So this battle went to court. I talked a little bit about it and how I was severely concerned about how this scraping could possibly be very dangerous if it was allowed to continue. But I didn't know the way the courts were going to go. But I was hoping sincerely that scraping would be ruled illegal. And the reason for this is there is essentially a computer hacking law. I'm forgetting the exact name of it, but LinkedIn was suing under this kind of computer hacking law, essentially alleging that HiQ was hacking them by scraping all this data that was publicly available through LinkedIn profiles, like you might have or I have. So it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided they weren't really interested in taking it. So they remanded it down to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and that's where we received our final ruling just this past week. So, drum roll, please. It turns out this data scraping is legal. Now, so I want to talk a little bit about this decision and how I feel about it, but also I want to kind of give you the, who's happy with it, who's upset about it. So first of all, let's just talk very plainly about the ruling. I think the ruling is wrong. I think so the ruling tells me two things, right? So I'm not necessarily sure from a legal perspective if the ruling is wrong. So let me just, clarify that. I will say that the ruling is certainly outside the interests of privacy professionals like myself. And I am sincerely concerned that this level of access to publicly available data that can just be scraped and used is essentially going to allow people to make more form-fitting profiles to regular people for the purposes of ad tech, and potentially other malicious reasons as well. Now, of course, companies will tell you that they're not using this maliciously, but it is important to know that with all data that is being shared in this way, it can very easily be used by people who are malicious actors to do things like find people who don't want to be found for whatever reasons, including a past, domestic violence and things like that, survivors and all that. But also, people may just not want to be found, right? We have a right to privacy under the U.S. Constitution. It's poorly enforced, and it's essentially been overwritten, but we do actually have that right under the Fourth Amendment. So, it does kind of feel like that this is just one more way that the U.S. court system has shown that there is no real right to privacy, that we are very quickly eroding away whatever right to privacy we may have had in this country, especially when it comes to the fact that we live more and more of our lives online. And because a lot of that data is publicly available or is easily scrapable or whatever, if we change our preferences, the internet's forever, right? So you can use things like the Wayback Machine, archiving, all that stuff to create, to look at things that were open once that are now hidden. Even if you go change your LinkedIn settings to private for everything today, someone could look up what your LinkedIn profile looked in yesterday or the day before or whatever they could access, and then use that to find out information about you, including where you work. And then, of course, they can deduce what office you're working on. They can assume what time you're going to be there. It can just get very creepy very quickly, right? And from a privacy perspective, I just think that this is a very bad idea. So who likes this ruling and who doesn't? First of all, HiQ loves this ruling, right? They are very interested in maintaining their business model. I genuinely think that if this was ruled illegal, they would not exist any longer because this was kind of their whole shtick. So obviously they're happy about it and LinkedIn's not happy about it. But there is some discussion that among historians, archivists, and journalists that, hey, this is actually a really great way for people in the business of finding other people for investigative reasons or historical reasons, or creating archives of things. It's really helpful for them because that data scraping is what allows things like the Wayback Machine. It allows reporters to find individuals to speak to, about certain upcoming stories, and a variety of other things like that, right? Where there would be an inherent interest. And journalists, I'm sure, and archivists and historians would probably argue that there's a public interest in this data being legally allowed to be scrapable. And if you told them it was a privacy issue, I imagine that they would turn around to you and say, well, if you are really worried about it, you would change your settings, and make it harder for us to do that. Now, personally, I think I've debunked that with the talk about looking at records that existed in the past, and keeping in mind the internet is more or less forever. But I do want to give them their due. This is one of the reasons they're happy about this decision. And, I think from a purely professional perspective, they're trying to come at it in a way that is not inherently against privacy. I don't think these people are against privacy. What I do think is that their professional interests kind of clash with privacy, and they're more interested potentially in having conversations about what can you do with data and how much data can we work with, as opposed to how can we minimize data and how can we make sure that data is kept as privately as possible. So now, of course, on the other side, privacy activists and advocates are very upset about the decision, as well as LinkedIn. Of course, as I mentioned, LinkedIn is probably upset from a business perspective. I'm not sure LinkedIn is super concerned on the privacy front, but I don't want to impugn their character or what have you. But from a privacy perspective, obviously this is very worrying, because you've essentially said, and by the way, this is not just this particular case. And one of the reasons that archivists and journalists and things are happy about this is because this isn't just about LinkedIn and HiQ. This means that all data scraping of this nature is potentially legal. And so that could have huge and broad sweeping implications. So on the privacy side, obviously you don't want your social media information harvested for whatever purpose. Clearview AI got in trouble for doing this for law enforcement. Now, if it looks like this type of thing is legal in the US, you can have a Clearview type company. And by the way, they do operate in the US. Essentially, from a federal perspective, being able to harvest huge amounts of your biological data and give it to police. Now, that is inherently more dangerous than them harvesting that data and giving it to ad tech or like marketing firms, because marketing firms just want you to buy something they have, right? The police are going to use this in ways that can possibly take away your liberty, or invade your privacy in ways that they can do on behalf of the state, right? So from a privacy perspective, it's really important that if we allow something like this to be legal, we have to find somewhere that it has limits, right? We can't allow for the Clearview example to be what is legal across the country, because then, there is essentially infinite government surveillance. And I think that's really, really dangerous. Obviously, there's a ton of surveillance that goes on right now in America, right? And one of the reasons that we have so many issues with data privacy and no federal privacy law in this country is because there's so much surveillance here in the US. But truthfully, as we move forward with precedents like this one, we have to push back as privacy professionals and advocates and say, it can be legal up until here, right? And for me, I think my personal take on this is, first of all, let me just put out that I'm not comfortable with this, right? I mentioned earlier, I'm not comfortable with this ruling. But, if you are going to go with a ruling like this anyway, I think it's really important that we kind of keep it in the private market sphere. And we specifically outlaw things like corporations using this to help police, right? So your Ring doorbell, anything so for example, people upload Ring doorbell cam stuff to the Citizen app or the, there's other apps like that too. But, if that data is accessible more or less publicly, it can be scraped too, right? So you're creating this giant, I don't like to use the word big brother, but, you're kind of, that's where you're heading towards. So Anyway, I think there has to be, if we're going to allow this for advertising, and again, I'm not super thrilled with that, I think there has to be a very hard line in the government space. And we just say, you know what, if we're going to let capitalism run its way with us in this way, then we have to make sure that the buck stops at giving to the government, right? It needs to just be used for ways to market things to people. And by the way, if we were really thinking about ways to make this type of harvesting safer for individuals, we need a global opt out, right? We need some way that you can register to, the system that's holding your data, or the people who are scraping your data, or the government, or some combination of the three, that you don't want this to happen, or you identify with a protected class, say like survivors of domestic abuse and things like that, that allow for people to protect themselves from the types of malicious acts that this scraping can lead to. So all in all, I think this is a genuinely bad decision. I'm very worried now that other companies, seeing this example, will try and do this with other social networks or other information, and essentially use it to compartmentalize profiles of individuals in very scary ways, perhaps more scary ways than we have right now. It just makes me nervous about our continued lack of privacy rights in this country. And I hope, although I'm not confident in that, we either get a federal privacy law that kind of, helps quash out a lot of these violations, or, and this is more likely, we just continue to get state privacy laws that make it harder to do this type of bulk collection, until there's finally enough disparity between the states that the federal government feels the need to step in. So essentially, that's it. This brings to an end our following of the LinkedIn versus HiQ case. Once again, I think this is a genuinely terrible decision. It might not be legally wrong, but it does indicate, in my opinion, the continued diminution of privacy rights of Americans in this country. All right, guys, that is our show for this week. I know it's a bit of a shorter episode. We will have a regular length episode next time. Meanwhile, have a wonderful continued Ramadan if you are celebrating. Happy semi-end of Passover. And for all of you who are celebrating, who were celebrating Holy Week, I hope you had a great Holy Week. All right, guys, that's it for this week. I'll see you next time. Bye now. Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. All right, guys, see you next time. Bye for now.